Welcome, everyone. This is everything you need to know about rent-to-own homes. My name is Adam Zock. I've helped facilitate over 100 rent-to-own transactions, and I became a licensed loan originator a few years ago, having seen both sides of the equation, both on the tenant and the investor side. Today, what we will cover is the U.S. rent-to-own market in general, the three different rent-to-own models, the two paths into a rent to own home, looking at both sides of the equation, both the people living in the home, the tenants, and those that own the inventory, the investors, a deep dive into the most common rent to own model, which would be the lease with an option to purchase, talk through the legal considerations, go through common pitfalls, and then some bonus items with free rent to own contracts that you can use and review for your benefit. To start, first, let's look at the US rent to own market as a whole. In general, the rent to own market typically is in the Midwest and Sun Belt. I've added some highlights of where there's more rent to own demand. But typically it's where the price to rent ratio is closer in higher cost markets. Let's say in California, if it's $1 million home that rents for $3,000 a month, it's less common than, let's say, in the middle of St. Louis, Missouri, where a $300,000 home rents for $2,000 a month. Overall, there are, according to Pew Research in 2021, 1.2 million households in rent-to-own contracts, which equates to just less than 1% of US adults. Most adults are renting or have a traditional mortgage, but there is over a million rent-to-own contracts in existence, and there's even more demand with people getting denied a mortgage, looking for alternative paths into home ownership, and investors looking at different ways to sell their property. The three ways into rent-to-own. So if you're following kind of the typical path, the ways into home ownership is you could start and just buy a home all cash. You would own the property, you only have to pay property taxes and home insurance. The second is seller financing, where you could have someone else hold the note. The third is the most traditional, where there's a mortgage. Then we get into the three ways to do rent to own. The first being a contract for deed, the next being a lease purchase, the third being a lease option, which is most commonly the rent to own. And then if you continue along the home ownership path, there is just traditional rental. So you can kind of see how you could go from owning a home all cash, free and clear, to renting a home with no equity. Rent to own is a little bit closer to a rental than a mortgage on this seven path system. So you go from cash to seller finance to having a mortgage into contract for deed, lease purchase, and then a lease option, which we will be walking through in detail, these three. So three different paths, three risk reward profiles. First of all, in terms of the buy obligation, in a lease option, the tenant may purchase the home. In a lease purchase, the tenant must buy the home. And in a contract for deed, or sometimes called land contract or installment sale, the buyer must pay off the mortgage. In terms of upfront costs, there's typically an option fee. 2 to 10% is pretty common on the option fee. In terms of a lease purchase, it's typically like an earnest money fee that's between 2 or 10%. And then a contract for deed, you are doing a true down payment, say 5 to 20%. In terms of monthly payments, a lease option is most commonly above market, and you're getting part of that back as a rent credit. For a lease purchase, very similar, where you negotiate a rental amount, which can have some credits to it, along with a set purchase price. On a contract for deed, you're actually doing principal and interest payments. So there's a set interest rate, which acts a little bit more like a mortgage. In terms of the legal or collateral, on a lease option, there's the option to purchase contract, which typically is not recorded in any county. On a lease purchase, it's a standard purchase and sale agreement, and you can sometimes file a memorandum of understanding at the county to help secure your interest in the property. in terms of a contract for deed, that should be recorded at the county in terms of the key tenant risk. If in a lease option, the tenant walks away, they forfeit that and the investor keeps the option fee. In terms of the lease purchase, they are stuck if the market dips. Of course, if the market goes the other way, the investor maybe lost out on some money because they could have waited and sold the property. In terms of a contract for deed, if you default on a contract for deed, the property owner or the investor or the deed owner would foreclose if you default. So as a tenant, you would get evicted in the lease option or lease purchase if you fail to execute the options, if you didn't understand what you're getting through, or you breached a contract on a contract for deed, you would get foreclosed on. In terms of the key investor risk, now remember, we're talking both sides, both the tenant and the investor, because this is covering all things rent to own. As in a lease option, your concern is you have vacancy if the tenant walks away. They have the option to buy, but they don't have to buy. In terms of the lease purchase, sometimes they can say, yep, I'm going to buy, I'm going to move in, I'm going to rent it, and I'll get financing later. But what happens if financing doesn't close? Well, then you have to put the property back on the market. You might have to evict. In terms of a contract for deed, it can be a really lengthy foreclosure process. Some states it's as short as 2 months, but most are 6 months plus on a foreclosure, depending upon your state. Those are the three options. So now here are the two different paths into rent to own. You have either existing inventory or on demand. Those are the two. In terms of the existing inventory, these are homes that investors already own and they're looking for someone to move in. So think of it, this is just your standard. You can look on Zillow, you can look somewhere else, and there's just a typical rental. But some of these are, hey, you can move into this home that an investor already owns on a specific set term and price, which we'll get into. In terms of the pros, I mean, this can be fast. You can have a property that's vacant, you can move in right away, and you know the home condition, should get a home inspection. You can look at the property and you're looking at that specific asset. The con is that there's not a lot of choices. As you can see, rent to own isn't as common as a normal rental or homes listed for sale. So there's limited choices in your area. If no one is offering rent to own, you typically then have to ask the seller or ask the landlord or the property manager if they're willing to enter a rent to own arrangement. So these are typically mom and pop landlords that own the property and are willing to sell it on a lease with an option to buy or a land contract. On demand is different. This is where an investor buys the home picked by the tenant. So a tenant gets approved by an investor who purchases a specific asset for the tenant to move into. This gives you a lot more flexibility. If there's no existing inventory in your area, you can have an investor on demand pick you a home and buy the home. The cons is that you have to acquire the property. So let's say that in existing inventory, the landlord has a 4% interest rate, but if you're buying a new property, let's say that the interest rate is 7%, there might be higher acquisition costs versus having existing inventory. So it might cost more to the tenant and to the investor to acquire a new property. A lot of these are fintech and institutional companies, which we will get into in a little bit. So how it works, to summarize, in the inventory model, the tenant shops a list of existing homes. They typically pay an option fee, apply, sign the documents, they move in, and then the option clock starts for them to exercise their option. And we'll talk about timeline and how long they have here shortly. In terms of the on demand, the tenant pre-qualifies with the investor to pick a home, let's say up to 400,000. They identify that home on the MLS and the investor actually purchases that home and the tenant signs a lease with an option once they move in and they close on the home. Let's do a deep dive into the two sides. You have the tenant and you have the investor. In terms of the tenant, the top three motivators are they want a home that they can build equity. Most of the clients that I'm familiar with, they want to stop throwing their money away on rent. They want to lock in a home purchase price and lock in a specific home for their family so they don't have to keep renting or they're not forced to move. And then there are another set of categories of people who just want to test drive the home. They're willing to pay a higher premium to see if they want to live there for the next 1 to 5 years. Some of the key hurdles are finding legit homes or companies that offer this type of a program and understanding all of the legal and contract language. And typically, the reason that tenants are looking for this is because they can't secure traditional financing or they're trying to get more creative than a traditional bank loan. On the other side of the equation, the top three motivators are an investor typically gets a non-refundable upfront option fee. So instead of getting 1 month security deposit, they might get 2 to 10% of the home purchase price, which looks very good to an investor. They typically get above market rent, and although they're giving a rent credit, it can be nice to cash flow from the investor perspective. And there's a predetermined exit price. You have a built-in buyer on the back end, so you could potentially get more cash up front, higher cash flow, and then you could sell typically without an agent because this would be a for sale by owner situation if they already own the existing home. If they're buying on demand, they would typically use an agent to acquire it, but in terms of selling it, this is what's attractive. The key hurdles are the vacancy risk. Not all rent to own contracts buy the home, so they can have the same vacancy risk as everyone else. And there's more compliance and paperwork, which we'll get into here, which stops some investors from moving forward and offering this to tenants. Typically, the tenant in a rent to own situation is missing one of the following. It's usually debt to income ratio where they have their back end at 43%. That's your typical Fannie Mae conventional mortgage. Sometimes with FHA, you can go a little bit higher. They maybe don't have the 620 credit score or they don't have the 3.5% down payment. These are the top reasons that someone would be looking at a rent to own is either their DTI doesn't quite fit the bank box, they maybe need to fix their credit, or they don't have the full down payment plus closing costs, so they're looking to get in and build equity along the way. The most common situations that I see is someone with low credit and low income, and they're trying to get really creative on a way to build wealth. And you have to be a little bit careful because you don't want to get taken advantage of. Sometimes it is just better to rent, fix your credit, increase your income to get your debt to income ratio better. So that's one scenario. The second scenario is someone with pretty good income. They just haven't been able to save for that down payment. And so they're making good income. They just haven't quite got to 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, whatever is needed to close on the home. So they're looking for a lower down payment, but they got a good credit score, good job, good debt to income ratio, good income. The last is someone with really good income and a lot of cash. They just don't meet the credit or the debt to income ratio. So these people might be making $200,000 a year and have $50,000 to put down, but because of the bank rules, they just can't quite get traditional financing. Let's say that they own their own construction company and they left being an engineer. Now they open up their own construction company. They make a lot of money, but they need 2 years of consistent tax returns as their adjusted gross income to be able to get into the traditional bank financing world. In terms of investors, why would they offer a rent to own or why would they consider it? Typically, they might have an existing property that's having trouble cash flowing, or they can't find any properties that do cash flow. So they're struggling with kind of the month to month to pay the underlying debt, the property taxes, the insurance, the home upkeep. Maybe they listed their home for sale and they got no takers. They listed their home and prices are dropping. It's a buyer's market. So they're saying, hey, what if someone moved in there to rent and then bought later? And lastly, they're looking for a way to get a higher return on their investment. Typically, real estate, you own the asset and appreciation and depreciation with time work to your benefit. So this would be a way that if they could get an upfront option fee or higher rent or a built-in buyer, they could potentially get higher ROI with this model. Now, the four common situations I see on the investor side are mom and pop owners. They own maybe 1 to 10 properties. They have some single family homes and they will entertain rent to own. They're listed out so that they can have someone help someone on their path to home ownership while they liquidate the property. The second would be high income professionals who, let's be honest, they can go to a bank and get a bank loan really easy. They have a good credit score, but they don't have a lot of time and they're looking for a way to get higher cash flow, a lot of these professionals will invest into real estate investment trusts, they'll invest into syndications, but some of them are considering getting into the rent to own space just because they can get a bank loan and they're essentially co-signing or helping someone else get into a home. The third are professional flippers and wholesalers. There's what's called like a lease option sandwich. So what they do is they try to acquire a home on a lease option and then sell it on a lease option, or they buy the home, fix and flip it to an end buyer. So they're buying a home at a discount, improving the asset. Let's say they bought it for 200,000, put 50 grand into it. Now it's worth 300,000. Now they can sell that home on a lease with an option to buy to someone because they've built the equity. They could, of course, just sell on the open market, but I've seen individuals do that as well, where they buy a property at a discount, add some work into it, and then sell it to a tenant over a period of 1 to 5 years. And then the last are the institutional players. So this could be someone like Home Equity Partners, Legacy, Barry Rock, Divvy Homes, Home Partners of America, Landis, Dream America. I'll talk through these, but these are some of the larger players that have a lot of capital raising power and can buy homes. Let's go through the most common rent to own transaction, the lease with an option to buy. So I'm not doing a deep dive into contract for deed, although I'll give you a contract and talk through the terms because that's a principal and interest payment, and a lease purchase works very similar, just with some nuances. But since this is the most common, I'm going to go a deep dive into everything so that you can understand all of the terms. So key terms. Number one, option fee. This is an upfront, non-refundable payment from the tenant to the investor that locks in the tenant's right, but not the obligation to buy. Number two, rent credits. A portion of each month's rent that is applied to the future purchase price or to help with down payment. So let's say that that's $300 a month. You would build that for every on-time payment. It doesn't come back to you every month. You would still be paying the total rent, but this is almost just like a credit that would come back to you every month. Option term, how long is the ability to exercise open? So a time window, typically 12 to 36 months, in which the tenant can exercise the purchase option from the current owner. The price, what's the pre-agreed price or the price formula that the tenant's going to buy the home at? Maintenance duty, the clause that says who's handling the day-to-day repairs and major systems for the tenant or the owner. And lastly, the exit choices. At the end of the term, what options do the tenant have? Can they buy? Can they sell? Can they assign it? Can they walk away? Do they get their money back? Those are the key 6 items that you're going to want to look for while you go through it. Now, we're going to do a really good deep dive here on the comparison between the tenants and the investors and going through typical ranges for all of these.
What we have here are the major categories: financial, property and compliance, along with contract terms, and then the tenant preference along with the investor preference. So if we look at the financial metrics of rent, the tenant buyer down payment or option fee, the equity margin, the refundable option fee, rent credits, the buyback price, who's paying closing costs and inspections. So looking at these one by one, what does the tenant want? The tenant wants the lowest amount of rent. The investor wants the highest amount of rent. The tenant wants to put down the lowest option fee. The investor wants to put down, the tenant to put down the highest amount. Equity margin, as we define it, which is the acquisition cost difference between the market value. So the difference between the acquisition cost and the market value. So if you have a home for 200,000, but it's actually worth 250,000, both parties want a good equity margin. A tenant would want a refundable option fee. The investor would want non-refundable. The tenant would want almost all of the rent payment to go towards credits. The investor wants the lowest amount. So there's a healthy tension here. The buyback price increase per year. The tenant wants the lowest amount. The investor wants the highest. Who pays the initial closing costs and who pays for an inspection on the home? The tenant wants the investor. The investor would like the tenant. And so what we did is we added a few categories of some examples on a rent price. So this is the average rent times 12% divided by the purchase price. So if this is a $200,000 home, this is $2,000 a month in rent. This is roughly $1,500. This is roughly $2,500. How much of a percent down the tenant is putting down? How much of an equity margin? Is it refundable? How much are standard rent credits? So we have a few values here that we can share and look at. As far as the property condition, both the tenant and the investor are looking for a great property in a great location. The tenant really wants to make sure that they're protected. The investor is open to flexible options on what that looks like. Of course, they want to follow the same rules, but from what we found is that the tenant is worried about, hey, how am I going to lose my money? Because the investor is the one on title. Tenants want to be able to get into a home with any credit score. Investors are looking for higher tenant buyer credit scores or just overall borrower grade. Tenants are hoping for maybe starter homes, nicer homes. So they're kind of going anywhere from low to high, whereas the investor is looking for kind of flexible. As far as contract terms, time to move in, tenants are often flexible, but a lot of times they want to move in right away. Who's responsible for repairs? The tenant wants the investor to take all of them. The investor would like it if the tenant took it. How long? Tenants are typically looking for the longest option period. They want to be able to have pets and smoking. Investors are looking for flexible terms and then potentially restricting either pets or smoking. So when you show all of these values and then go through the categories, the only ones I didn't quite go through were some of the low, average, and high, but you can kind of see the ranges here of from the investor taking the responsibility to the tenant, typical lengths, what a tenant buyer grade is just in general a lower grade versus a high credit score, high income earner, and then some average purchase prices along with some homes. So as you go through the negotiations, these are the key categories that we have found to be the most impactful from a negotiation standpoint between the tenant and the investor.
So let's do a recap. The lease option 5-step journey. Typically, it's apply and approve for either existing inventory or on demand. You sign and pay the option fee, get in your contract with the ability to move in. You rent and you build credits. You prepare to qualify, and then you buy, assign, or walk. So this is the tenant and the investor's kind of path to how they see acquiring properties or selling their homes between the two. Let's look at an example deal of inventory versus on demand. So this is just a snip of a listing of a rent to own transaction. Here, there's a listing. It says, here's the property address. Looks like a new construction. They give you the bed, the bath. They say, this is your monthly payment. Here's your down payment. Here's your monthly savings. Here's a buyback price. And then they have some additional terms. So I'll share a little bit more on how to find some of these, but this would just be like an example listing of a property that you might find on Facebook Marketplace. In terms of on demand, and looking a little bit more into the on demand, here is a site, Zegacy, where you could sign up as a tenant or an investor and do some matchmaking. There's other programs like Divvy Homes, Home Partners of America, Landis, Home Equity Partner, Berry Rock. So there's a lot of different options, and I'll get into talking through what that looks like. Let's take the next step of legal, a very important topic to cover. The first are the state rent-to-own rules. What are the fee caps, the disclosures, and the buyer protections vary by state. I can't go state by state. There's some good resources searching online on the different requirements, but I will go through a few specific examples. Not a lot of states have rent-to-own rules. They have landlord rules and they have mortgage rules, but I'll go through the contract for deed or rent-to-own options that are currently in market right now. The second is to record or not record. So always follow state compliance, talking with a real estate attorney. This isn't legal advice. This is always talk to a local real estate attorney because they're going to understand all of the rules better because it can be state or city. There's not too many federal laws. There's a few of them. So in general, that's kind of a catch-all, but I'm going to get you educated on some of the questions to ask and the right way to do this. So the second is the record versus not record. Generally, filing a memo or filing something at the county secures the tenant's interest. If you skip it, it keeps things simple, but that's from a legal protection. If you have a document filed at the county, that shows your equitable interest in the property so that whoever the investor is, they can't sell it to someone else. But there is some added risk for the investor if you go on title, because now if you default, they have to get you removed from title. So you might have to come up, they might ask for you to come up with a higher down payment. They might ask for different things because it is more legal risk for the investor. The next is the licensing and finance laws, specifically on the contract for deed or seller finance. Typically, it's not doing more than 3 deals in a 12-month calendar period. So that is specific to the Dodd-Frank and SAFE Act for seller financed deals. In terms of the default remedy, in a lease, there is a quick eviction. In a land contract, it's a long full foreclosure. So as a tenant, you want a land contract because you are on title and it's really hard to get you out. If you're an investor, you want to do a lease with an option to buy because it's typically a eviction versus a foreclosure. Again, this isn't a legal advice, but just from a simplicity perspective, you can see how both sides are trying to balance all of the financial versus legal and contractual terms. So let's look at a couple specific examples. Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, and Cincinnati, they have specific lease option requirements that say if you have to file it, giving notice, what you can do for option fees, what sort of statements and disclosures you have to state between the two parties. In Illinois, the seller must record the land contract within 10 business days. Once they've paid over 20% of the price, you can no longer evict. They must foreclose instead. So here's just a couple examples on lease options and specific Illinois. Texas has some similar language on land contracts as well. In Ohio, similar things where they want these contracts recorded. In fact, it's a requirement to do so. In terms of the Dodd-Frank and SAFE Act, a one natural person can own or finance up to 3 homes per year. So if you own real estate, you can do 3 basically land contracts per rolling 12-month period. If you do more than 4, you might have to go through some licensing or have the ability to repay. Now, most investors are not issuing more than 3 land contracts per year, but this is specific to investors on compliance. So a lot of this is the buyer needing to record a contract, but a lot of it could be the seller recording the contract or following specific rules and regulations. Now, in terms of legal, the eviction versus the foreclosure clock. Typically, a standard eviction is, the 30 to 45 days, and a contract for deed can be 4 to 9 months for any typical process for the legal, should this go the wrong way. Now, in a perfect situation, tenants just buy the home, they move forward, or land contract, they exercise their option to get traditional financing or buy the home all cash, and you avoid all of these specific issues. But if you're looking at worst case scenario, here's to get educated on what could or may happen. Let's look at some best practices and due diligence. For the tenant, clearly understand the terms. Hopefully this webinar was helpful. And as we go through an example contract here in the future, you got to know all of your key terms and what's important to you. Are you paying an option fee? If so, how much, and is it refundable? What's the timeline? Do you have 6 months or 12 months? Do you want as long as possible to exercise your option or the ability to extend? What's your price? Is it a fixed price? Having a fixed price helps everyone out. If it's a calculation or if it's based on a future appraisal, it can get really gray area. And then understand who's in charge of repairs. Are you taking on maintenance and capital expenditures, or is that still the duty of the investor? And then are you getting rent credits? If so, how much? Be sure that you have a realistic timeline for mortgages. It always takes more effort, time, and length than most people think to get a mortgage. So if you think you can get a mortgage in 1 year, give yourself 2 years. If you think it's going to be 2 years, give yourself 4 years. If you think it's going to be 4 years, give yourself 10 years. It usually takes longer. Your financial situation can change, so you want to get as long of a period as you can to exercise your option. In terms of protection, it's best to have an attorney review it, and it's best in your protection to record either a memorandum or file the document at your local county showing that you have interest in the property. For investors, the best is to have a standard transparent contract. So this is if you're doing a lot of these, you can have a standard option to purchase or a standard land contract that you just edit per specific deal. A local real estate attorney will give you some good options. We'll give you some examples here at the end of this webinar. And you want to choose a good balance between risk, reward, and supporting conversion. So if you're taking on a lot of risk, that does make sense to charge more or to get a higher down payment because you're taking on that added risk. But don't set up a contract so that you're just going to, evict or have to foreclose on the tenant. You want to give them the best chance of buying back the home, given your situation on what sort of debt financing and balloon payments that you have. Make sure that you comply with local statutes and document everything. This isn't a handshake agreement. Yes, you can buy the home, I promise. This is get everything in writing, and that goes for both sides. Common pitfalls and misconceptions about rent to own. In terms of the misunderstanding, most people think that the tenant always buys, where in reality, at maximum, 50% of tenants exercise their option to buy. It would be great if more of them did that, but nationally, I would say that it's closer to the 25% of them actually closing on the home. And this can be because the tenant doesn't understand it or the investor is being difficult. But in general, the tenant doesn't always buy, even though they have good intentions. And so if you're a tenant, realize that the statistics aren't in your favor, and investors don't assume that all tenants are going to buy the property. A rent credit is not the same as a down payment. So if in your lease option agreement, if let's say that they're paying $3,000 a month in rent and getting $300 a month in credits, you want to explicitly state that in the contract that the tenant gets these, because there are specific rules saying that they can use the rent credits towards their down payment or their closing costs, as long as you explicitly state that in the contract. Otherwise, it might be difficult for your loan officer, for the tenant, when they're buying the home, to count that towards your 3.5% or 5% down payment. But it is possible, just don't confuse the two. I've seen option fees way too low. If it's anything at 1%, I mean, the tenant is pretty much, just there for test driving, is most likely going to walk away. So if it is low, realize that they are test driving it. I mean, this would be a good deal for the tenants, but when investors think that if they can get 1% or 2% down from the tenants, they're not financially committed to the property. So from the investors, always target kind of a minimum of 2 to 5% if you are looking for the tenant to purchase the property. And it does help cover your basis should properties not go up, or if the property does go up a lot, you are now, locked into selling the home to them. The other misunderstanding is just vague price and terms. You want to have clearly spelled out what the exact purchase price is at any point in the future. Very easy to understand so that a loan officer can calculate it and have a firm expiration date. Sometimes it just says, hey, I'll sell you the property in the next 3 years. That doesn't give you specific purchase price and timing. How much, when, what's the rent credits, what's the exact purchase price? If they put down an option fee, does that lower the final purchase price? Does that count towards their down payment? Get through all of their terms. Next is the repair gray zone. You need to specify who is covering everything. Does the tenant handle routine fixes where the owner covers the major systems? Is the owner responsible for everything like a typical landlord? Is the tenant doing, all of the repairs in a land contract? You really need to know who is doing what, and so that it's spelled out in the agreement. Let's talk through some bonus items and some additional items. So how do I find these homes? Is a common question I get. Then we're going to walk through a sample option contract, walk through a sample contract for deed. I can give you a reference to a podcast doing these, and then there's a couple other companies that are helping people get into homes. So how do I find a rent to own home? In general, if you're looking at existing inventory, you can Google search rent to own homes near me. It's pretty good. You could use, AI to help you. You could talk to local agents if there's companies or if there's a known um, investor that is known to do this, or maybe there's an institutional buyer. A lot of luck on Facebook marketplaces. And then there's a lot of local groups, whether it's Facebook groups, meetup groups, clubs, where you can ask these questions to get to find the next people. In terms of on demand, you can find these institutional buyers by, searching on Google, getting referrals to find what sort of institutional investors are buying in my area. There are some institutional investors that buy nationwide, which we'll get into in a little bit. Investors. So in order to find a tenant, so now putting on their other hat, these are investors looking to find a tenant. How do you find a tenant that wants to do a rent to own for your property? Well, you can list it on Zillow in the top rental sites and just add in that this is a rent to own opportunity and add that into the description. You can post it on Facebook Marketplace, like the example that we shared today, where you can say, hey, rent to own opportunity available for my specific property. You could add this on as an option when selling your home. You could say also open to seller financing or rent to own options to help increase the likelihood of selling your home. In terms of on-demand investors, if you wanted to specifically be paired with a tenant, Legacy is a good idea. You can look at Home Equity Partner. There's Unbankable out of Minnesota. If you're looking for specific deals, those are some of the top on-demand options for investors looking to acquire new properties. Let's look at an example lease option. Here is an example of a standard option to purchase agreement. This would go along with a standard lease. So you can see this says when the agreement is on, who it's between, the specific property, and then it starts getting into the key terms, which is what's the option term? How long do they have? In this case, 5 years. The notice required and how they're saying, hey, I want to buy this home to legally say I'm exercising my option. Number three, this is the option consideration or the option fee. This is how much the buyer is putting down in terms of an option fee. So how much the buyer or the optionee is paying the seller or optioner. There's just some legal language in here. And they understand that the option fee is non-refundable. Next, the purchase price. In this case, it shall be this set and then increase by X% per year, less a credit of X amount and an additional credit of Y amount per month, assuming that they pay Z amount in advance on the first day of every month. So in this case, the purchase price changes by, in this case, 0% per year. So it would just be that they're going to buy the home at a set fixed price and that they get credits based on this. Credits can be used to reduce the purchase price in this case. So in here, having specific language to reduce the purchase price, I would add in some language to say that this can be used at, if allowed by the lender, to count towards down payment. In terms of extension of the term, looks like you can extend the option for a period of a certain number of months if you put down an initial additional option consideration. This is the exclusive and non-assignable closing and settlement. This talks about as the seller and the buyer, who's paying for what once the option is being exercised. So the seller typically pays their own existing liens, recording fees, release of loans, and the buyer is going to cover their own mortgage costs, title costs, appraisal costs to acquire the property. Talk about financing, what happens if they default. This talks about if the buyer defaults on it, they have the non-refundable and then they are in breach of the contract. If the seller defaults on their underlying mortgage, that the buyer has the ability to seek damages as allowed by law and to potentially cover the lapsed payments to still exercise their option, saying that this isn't agreement. In this one, it says it shall not be recorded at the local public office unless required by law, acknowledges some state and local rules, and then goes through some, I'm going to call them legal jargon on liability, indemnity, arbitration, and then some additional considerations about the breach of the contract, talking about the condition of the property, when the appraisal will be done, saying that this is presented as is condition, saying that if the buyer wants to have their appraisal done, if they're waiving their appraisal, if the buyer is getting an inspection, which I would highly recommend. If you're going to enter in the option to purchase a home, you're going to want to get an inspection just like anything else. So this is initially whether you are or are not getting it, having the repairs, who is in charge of covering repairs. In this event, repairs exceeding $10,000 are by the seller. Anything under that, the buyer is responsible for in terms of disclosures and property insurance, who's covering the property insurance. If the buyer needs to enroll into credit repair, who's that going to be, the condition of the home, and then this is the entire agreement. And this is simply signatures, does not need to be notarized. So I flew through that pretty quick, but this is what like a standard option to purchase looks like. Every state, every attorney is going to look a little bit different, but here's an example. In terms of a land contract, this is going to look similar, but this one gets notarized and for sure gets filed at the county. So it's between who? Which parties, the buyer or the seller and the purchaser. They agree to sell what specific piece of land using the tax ID and the typical name. Terms of the payment. It says it's going to sell the property for a certain amount, of which you're giving a certain down payment, and the rest is to be paid later at a certain interest rate and a certain amortization. So you would get an amortization table showing what's going to principal, what's going to interest. It shall be paid in monthly installments, starting on which date, when is it going to due, and there's a balloon on this one which says, hey, within X number of years, you need to pay off the entire balance. They might not just hold the note for 30 years. You need to pay this off in, let's say, 1 year, 5 years, 20 years. How to convey title. Once you've paid this off, the purchaser gets on title and they now have the deed. They talk about the duties to follow to purchase the property. The purchaser or the person living in the home pays all of the taxes and home insurance on this property along with all of the upkeep. Sometimes they can escrow the taxes and insurance, but in this case, they're talking about the purchaser taking all of the taxes and insurance and paying those fully. If they do not, what happens? You can go into foreclosure. Here is the monthly addition to the monthly payments. If there needs to be an estimated coverage for taxes and insurance, acceptance of the title commitment, so making sure that they actually own the property. So if you're a purchaser and the seller says, hey, I'll sell you the home, you're going to want a title commitment from a title company saying that they actually have the right to sell the home. They might have other liens or encumbrances that would not allow you to buy the home. So this is just saying have a title commitment done to ensure that you have the legal right to purchase the home. Here's the maintenance of the property, that they're going to keep it in good condition, the person living in the home. This is saying that the seller can have their own mortgage on the property following some specific rules and not to overextend themselves. What happens if there's encumbrances? What happens if the purchaser fails to pay taxes or insurance? Short summary is you can have the seller pay them, but essentially you'd be in default. In this one, there's no assignment, so you as the buyer can assign this to someone else. That is negotiable. In terms of possession, the right to forfeiture, if there's any need to accelerate the clause where they need to foreclose on the property, if there's a breach, what happens with insurance proceeds? Should there be an insurance claim? First goes to pay any underlying, debt necessities, cover the repairs, and then being listed as additional insured on the property, giving proper notices. And then these documents, as you can see here, get notarized and filed because you want it notarized to be able to be filed at the county and at the local jurisdiction. So there you have it. Everything you need to know about rent to own homes. If you want to learn about more, you can search the pre-approved podcast. There's a lot of about 50 episodes talking through things in more depth. If you're looking for companies that buy homes for people, you can look at Home Equity Partners, Legacy, Berry Rock Homes. Some of these larger ones have suspended applications, but you can check them out, like Divvy Homes, Home Partners of America, Landis, and Dream. And just as a recap, we covered the U.S. rent-to-own market, the three different models between a lease option, a lease purchase, a contract for deed, the on-demand versus existing inventory paths into rent-to-own, the pros and cons for both the tenants and the investors, a deep dive into the most common rent-to-own contract, the lease option, the legal considerations, the common pitfalls. We walk through an example document and some bonus free contracts. If you want, you can comment on this video and we will send you Word document copies of that. Thank you, everyone. Have a good time.